Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy and hot day to join us. We're very happy to have you here. I know this topic has generated a lot of interest. My name is Meredith. I'm with the Honda Center for Human Rights, and we are pleased to bring you this event along with the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society that made Chiara's visit to campus and this event possible. So thank you for joining us for today's talk, Ethics of Humanitarian Fieldwork, featuring Dr. Chiara Lepora. Dr. Lepora's career has been dedicated to increasing access to care for those who are suffering, oftentimes in challenging or perhaps dangerous situations in their countries of origin or where they're located. And through her work with Doctors Without Borders and other agencies, they have really strived to increase access to health care for people in acute crises, whether it's natural disasters, conflict, serving refugees and IDPs. And inevitably, as many of you know from your own research, your own field work, and your own experiences, these bring up ethical dilemmas and ethical questions. Often, as Chiara says, you're forced to ask yourself and answer questions in non-ideal circumstances. So we're delighted to have Dr. Lepora's presentation today, and we'll also leave time for conversation and Q&A from the audience, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. And my guess is by the end of today, many of you may walk out here with more questions than answers and get you thinking, but hopefully we'll have some answers as well. Dr. Lepora currently works for the International Committee of the Red Cross as a detention doctor in Algeria. Prior to working with the Red Cross, Dr. Lepora worked with MSF, Doctors Without Borders, for more than a decade in the Middle East and Africa, leading medical humanitarian programs in countries throughout the Middle East and Africa. In addition to her field work, which has largely informed her research and publications, Dr. Lepora has published scholarly books and articles in leading outlets in philosophy, including her book on complicity and compromise, engaging in pressing questions about individual and collective complicity in the face of global injustices. Dr. Lepora trained as a medical practitioner at the Universities of Pavia and Lisbon and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's also featured in an award-winning documentary film about MSF's work called Living in Emergency. So if you didn't get enough of Dr. Lepora today, you can go home and watch the movie this evening and stay cool. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lepora. Thank you for joining us.
So thanks a lot, Meredith, for this nice introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm here to talk about humanitarian ethics, and
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm sorry. I'm going to increase the volume.
And I am going to share with you somewhat of a radical view on humanitarian ethics. And I have two disclaimers to make at the beginning. The first one was that I initially thought to call it an extremist view on humanitarian ethics, but then I was told that people might have negative association with the word. So I'm calling it radical, hoping to convince you better with that word. The second disclaimer is that I'm really talking about my own opinions. And yeah, I've been working with Doctors Without Borders and the International Committee of the Red Cross. But really what I'm going to discuss today is a sort of very broad thinking that is personal to myself. It does not represent any position or policy of MSF or the ICRC. It does not represent any position or policy of the National Institutes of Health, which is the place where I did my ethics studies a few years ago. So, in order to discuss about humanitarian ethics, I would like us to make a step back and to talk about humanitarian in general and sort of the definition of what do we consider to be humanitarian. And one interesting aspect, historical aspect, is that the word was first used in the 17th century, and it was used to define a person believing that Christ's nature was humane only and not divine. So by that definition, all the Muslims of the word, for instance, would be humanitarians today. Then, of course, the word somewhat evolved, and the use of the word evolved quite a lot. If we take the broader definition, we're talking about all types of activities that are seeking to promote human welfare as a primary or preeminent good. And then, by extension, it goes to any person who's seeking to promote human welfare as a primary or preeminent good. So this is such a broad definition that I generally find it a little bit unuseful. What is also sort of problematic is that the word humanitarian has been used and keeps on being used in very inappropriate way. So we all heard about humanitarian bombings, for instance, all sort of activity that somebody at some point wanted to justify and label them as humanitarian. So one of the current views that has not yet passed out of fashion, and I want to set out for today, is the use of this. For instance, we often say here talking about humanitarian crisis. So I don't think there is any crisis that seek to promote human welfare. So let's set aside that use and say that there are human crises that might require humanitarian intervention, but those are not humanitarian crises. So that's a typical use. But also there are all the other sort of more common and a little bit less recognizable way of misusing, in my view, this word. Of course, military intervention often wants to depict themselves as humanitarian, and also religious proselytism sometimes adds component to its action so that the action gets to be defined as humanitarian. So if we keep the broad definition that I initially gave to promote social welfare, yes, maybe there are some reasons to include those aspects. And there are then reasons as well to include aspects like Michael Jackson donating a lot of money for charities, or simply the fact of donating some money to a beggar in the street. Personally, I do think that using humanitarian for all those variety of action provided in a variety of fashion is not helpful. And I'm going to discuss why I think this is not helpful, particularly talking about the ethical aspect of providing humanitarian aid to people in need. Using my radical point of view, all these, and including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, should not be called humanitarian. So I'm not trying at this point to say that those actions are less valuable or morally less valuable, let's say, than humanitarian action itself. I'm just setting a distinction in terms of saying maybe we should call them in different ways. And there are different names. There is philanthropy, there are charities, there are a lot of different ways to determine social aid or political activism. I just think there is a fundamental distinction with what today we should call humanitarian. So where does that distinction, in my view, come from? It really comes from the idea of humanitarian as a principle-based activity, and an activity that is primarily ideological, so based on some ethical principle and trying to put in practice those ethical principles. Now, what I'm claiming is that the principle that everyone knows, so we take the four most common one, neutrality, humanity, impartiality, and independence, those are not something that we add into humanitarian action in order to make it nice. What I would like to claim is that those are conditions that define the borders and the limits of humanitarian action. And so that by using those ethical principles, we can determine what is humanitarian action, and anything that cannot fulfill or let's say doesn't have the aim of fulfilling all those four basic principles should be called in other ways. So let's go one by one. I'm not going, I think everyone is kind of familiar with those principles. Is that something that you all know about? Okay. So what I would like to point out is really how each of them has a specific practical component. Neutrality, for instance. Neutrality is about who provides humanitarian aid and who is this provided to? And one idea that I think is essential of our modern vision, modern Western vision of humanitarian aid, is that it really is provided to foreigners, to people who are unrelated to us. And this is an essential aspect for neutrality. I do think I strive for neutrality in a lot of conflicts, not necessarily because I don't think there's a right and wrong, but because I think neutrality is an essential component of humanitarian action. But I don't think I would be able to be neutral, for instance, if I was working in Italy like with migrants arriving at this point. Because I'm Italian, because I'm part of that community, and therefore my views are informed in a way that doesn't really allow me to be as objective or as neutral, if you want, in my actions as we want humanitarian action to be. So that's one first aspect that I think is important. And if we want to have a sort of extreme argument to say that, is that if I help my sister, none of you is going to call that humanitarian. So we kind of agree in saying that, yeah, humanitarian really should be given to somebody we don't know enough or we don't know too much of to start with. Meaning we don't have other moral reasons to provide them some help. The second aspect is humanity, or sort of universality. And here I think this is a really problematic point, because when we talk about universality, we really have to define something that is really universal. So we have a tendency of thinking that things that we consider good are good for everyone. But as soon as we put that in practice in the world, in different communities, in people with different backgrounds, it's very easy to actually come and get to see the limitations of our view as a subjective one. So what I claim is that the principle of universality and humanity should inform our action and limit to some sort of action that is really universal. And what is really universal, in my view, particularly in a crisis situation, is to alleviate suffering. There is no population anywhere in the world that thinks that alleviate suffering in a desperate situation, in a crisis situation, should really never be done under any condition. So that's universal enough, and to me that's sufficient to say, okay, maybe our action, our humanitarian action, should limit itself to that. One other principle is impartiality. And this, of course, is a very fundamental principle both for Doctors Without Borders and the International Committee of the Red Cross, but I would say it's a definitely recognized essential principle, not only in conflict, but in a lot of situations. Because it talks about providing humanitarian aid on a non-discriminatory basis. And we can take the non-discriminatory basis somewhat to be similar to what we said at the beginning, so to provide it to people that we are unrelated to, we do not have any other specific moral reason to feel obligated to help. How I like to think about impartiality is really that it should inform the provision of humanitarian aid purely on the basis of needs. And so that I would alleviate the suffering, deciding on, depending on my resources, deciding on the existence of needs, rather than population, groups that I feel more or less akin to, or even rather than consideration about cost effectiveness. The first decision that needs to be made is an impartial decision. So where are the higher needs? And then on that first decision, maybe if there are two groups where the needs are equal and one can provide maybe more reasons for success, okay, once the first condition is fulfilled, we can ask ourselves further questions. But we cannot ask ourselves further questions unless we determine where the needs really are. And the last aspect, the last principle, let's say, it's independence. And that, in my view, should somewhat inform the reason for my action. This is really something that people who agree in principle with humanitarian action never think enough about, I think. But it's very hard to explain to somebody who doesn't believe that humanitarian action is meaningful or is legitimate, to explain to them why do we need it, or why do we do it, rather. And I would say, I would limit the definition there in saying that it must be disinterested, so not self-interested, again as a preeminent way. This definition would apply to organizations, I would say, rather than to persons. I think any of us working in humanitarian action have, of course, their own reasons. Some might be better than others. But overall, the important thing is the organization, and the action in and of itself is designed in a way that does not bring us back to a second interest that we might have. So, if we take those principles to be defining what humanitarian is, we reach a definition of humanitarian that is much, much smaller than the initial one of promoting human welfare, and is really providing aid that alleviates the suffering of population that we have no specific relationship with, purely on the basis of needs and in a non-self-interest manner. So this is a definition that is so strict that it really excludes a lot of what today we call humanitarian here, and what a lot of what is called humanitarian in a lot of different cultures. The reason for which I think, as Westerner, we do have an additional reason, if you want, to stick to something as strict as that, is that Western history of humanitarian aid is really a bad one. Like, humanitarian aid has been used in colonialism, it has been used in proselytism, it has been used in imperialism, and this is unfortunately a recurrent history. So if we really believe that humanitarian is something that should not have something to do with colonialism, racism, and all the other isms that unfortunately we exported in big parts of the world, then we should really restrict ourselves and do something that somewhat doesn't put us in a difficult position to answer to those questions, or that really separates what we are doing today in terms of humanitarian action compared to what we have been doing in the past, or what some of us are still doing today. Why do I think this humanitarian matters as a label? Well, first of all, for this sort of double relationship between principles and action, for which I really think there needs to be a correspondence, but then also for very practical reasons. So in war, it's a guarantee for protection, and it's the only guarantee for protection that we can claim. And of course, it is inscribed in the Geneva Conventions. It is something that humanitarians want to somewhat make public as much as possible. But there's no way of somewhat claiming protection in a conflict, if we're not neutral to start with. So the fact of ensuring those four conditions that I mentioned before is essential in order for us to be able to provide work in safe environment. Well, you all know that unfortunately what I'm saying now is not particularly fashionable, so there has been a lot of humanitarian groups and activities and projects that have been targeted in these last years as much as in the past partially. Really, the message that humanitarians keep on giving is we're not part of the fight. here there's a funny contradiction between the International Committee of the Red Cross and MSF. So one of the advertisements used by the International Committee of the Red Cross was this one, like, don't shoot us, we're not part of the fight. And MSF made a sort of funny response that is in Italian, but I'm going to translate it. So there was the bombing of the MSF hospital, and the way in which the armed forces were explaining it, were saying, no, we're the good ones, we don't shoot on the Red Cross. You didn't find it funny? Another disaster. So let's take the situation aside, but let's think about another type of situation like an earthquake, let's say. Here, usually humanitarian groups happen to function and work outside the strict boundaries of national laws. So they work in illegal ways. And that's particularly true if we think about doctors, because as doctors in theory we're supposed to be recognized when we go and work, recognized by the medical order when we go and work in a certain situation. Well, disaster somewhat sets us aside from those basic duties that would be happening in any normal country that has laws on that. So that's a sort of very complicated position to be in. And we can say that we do it because we're the good guys, but really, if the others don't believe that we're the good guys, then we're still doing something that is fundamentally illegal. So here, it's another reason, in my view, to maintain a very, very strict definition of what humanitarian is as something that is a condition for our action. And so we can justify sort of working illegally insofar as we respect the official conditions that have been agreed upon in general, sort of by the vast majority of the world. So overall, those principles and the fact of maintaining our action within those boundaries provides legitimacy. It's not the only source of legitimacy, but I would say it's a fundamental one towards the beneficiaries as much as towards the donors. Because if we manage to be transparent in saying those are our principles, if we manage as much as possible to work towards those principles, since of course none of them is somewhat respected and applied 100% at all times, but they are process and sort of points we are walking towards, then I would say we have a way of explaining our legitimacy. So there are a whole lot of activities that are definitely morally praiseworthy, but that simply, in my view, should not be called humanitarian. So creating peace, for instance, it's a very typical one. I do not think that humanitarian action creates peace. I do not think that it fights poverty. I do not think that outsourcing activities as a sort of mode of intervention is humanitarian per se. Or providing funding to organizations. And then, of course, there's a sort of broad discussion about development aid, so aid outside of specific disaster crises. In my radical view, those are not humanitarian, specifically humanitarian. And what does it mean? Of course, again, I'm not saying that those are not valuable, or I'm not saying that people should be more suspicious about those compared to humanitarian per se. What I think is just that all those other activities have different questions to answer to. And that applying, or somewhat trying to apply in a strict way, the humanitarian principles I described before to these type of activities will be very, very hard. But that maybe that's not necessary. Maybe the type of ethical principles that we need for those type of activities are just completely different. So are the more new ones, like solidarity, like respect or respect for the autonomy of either people or population. So there's a lot of more sophisticated, let's say, principles that probably applies better and should be used much more to determine whether any of those activity is being done in an ethical fashion or not. Whereas confusing the two, alleviating suffering, with all these is somewhat unhelpful. And I think it's unhelpful for the beneficiaries, and it's unhelpful for donors who in general are not that informed about specific activities. And it's very, very unhelpful for humanitarian workers themselves, who find themselves very often somewhat torn in between the fact of doing an activity for a certain organization, having in mind certain principles, and then not managing to put all those aspects together. And so finding themselves in very stressful, morally stressful situation. So the humanitarian label matters because all those other activities as well, development aid, but talking about effectiveness, talking about cooperation, participation, talking about poverty, local community involvement, all those things is important, but it should be held to accountable to different principles, not the same ones. So I guess the majority of people who work in humanitarian work for those other type of activities. And somewhat, I think that's just a personal choice. And again, there's no right and wrong in this. But what I think is, for anyone who works on a non-specifically, radically humanitarian situation, as the one I mentioned, I think that the important questions to ask yourself, if you want to try to ensure the fact that your work is ethical, is to consider on which of the basic principles your work and your organization diverge from the radical humanitarian description I just gave. And then to somewhat explore that. So if I work for, again, a funding organization that promotes social welfare by outsourcing activities to local communities, then I know that I definitely have an issue with the type of activity. And I have to ensure that the what of that four-column scheme I just showed is effective and practically works and people think it works. Or if I work for a religious organization, then I have to explore the aspect of why. Why am I doing it? Because of course I cannot say that is outside of self-interest. And so there's a case to answer. Again, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, it just should be done with a set of ethical questions that differs from the basic ones I asked. Then one thing that Meredith asked me before when I was trying to prepare for this talk was, she was saying, think about what you would have wanted to know before starting to work as a humanitarian. And I've been thinking a lot about that since we last talked, because I think I was one of those people who started working in humanitarian in the most wrong way possible. I had the wrong reasons, I was not prepared enough, I was rather ignorant of a lot of aspects. And to be fully honest, if I knew back then things that I've learned throughout, I don't think I would have ever done it. So I'm not going to tell you things I know today. I just can tell you my first question, that was really a decisive one. And I would never have left for my first mission if I didn't have that, was whether there was a shower. They told me yes, and then the shower was a cup, so it was very difficult. But overall, if there's really just one thing that I think everyone should keep in mind and consider. Humanitarian action is a very complex one, whether we are talking about my radical view or any other. And the most fundamental aspect of it, I think, is about listening. and being able to explain. And this process of listening and explaining and failing to explain and listening again and trying to re-explain, etc., is something that really must inform us as individuals and must inform our organizations as organizations and must inform our funders in general as donors and responsible. Thank you.